Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 77. And today I'm joined by Shawn Wildermuth. And I think this is going to be one of those episodes that doesn't really have an explicit topic as such. We're just going to talk dev stuff, career stuff, and see where it takes us. So welcome to the show, Shawn.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
It's going to be a fun conversation, I can tell, because I know you've got like a big career where you've done lots of different things, so it'd be good to dive into those. And I guess a lot of listeners, especially in the .NET space, a lot of the listeners will be .NET developers, will have already heard of you. But for those that haven't, can you just give the listeners a quick intro to yourself?
Sure. I've been doing this for 35 years, I think, at this point. I think this year is 35. And I started as a database developer. Before that, I had a VIC-20 and then a Commodore 64, just for the old listeners to be able to go, I remember that. And about 20 years ago, I started doing much more teaching. A lot of people will know me from Pluralsight or my YouTube channel or conferences. I've loved doing conferences for a long time. Most of the stuff I care about these days is back-end and front-end for web development, so API design, database development, as well as JavaScript, TypeScript on the front end.
Very cool. Yeah, I think I'm about 30 years commercial programming, so I'm 5 years behind you, but...
You look a lot better than I do.
I don't know whether I feel it or not, but yeah, it's quite a long time. I find it very interesting how things have changed over the years, and especially like now, obviously we're kind of entering a huge change with obviously AI and how that's affecting our industry. So I'm kind of quite interested to what the next chapter is.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. This isn't the first time everyone's told me that developers are going away in my career. So I'm probably a little bit more suspicious than excited, just because I've heard this, 5 years into my career, they were using case tools and they said, people will be able to just describe their app and case tools would solve it. And then ComObjects, brought out the famous secretaries are going to be able to code article, so this isn't that new to me. I think what AI is doing is pretty revolutionary, but I would argue that, especially for developers, we've been using AI for 30 years. We didn't call it AI, right? IntelliSense and Visual Studio is essentially AI, right? It's not as sophisticated as LLMs but it's the same sort of thing. Everyone who loves ReSharper, guess what? This is we're taking another leap up. But I don't think people should be too afraid of it just going away, or that they're going to be just writing prompts and everything's going to work perfectly.
This AI thing is definitely something I want to continue with. But before we do, I just need to do the episode's start-off mentions. And the first one is just a reminder to the listeners that this podcast has its own Discord community. And if you head over to the website, unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big Discord link there. And outside the episodes, that's the best place to be part of the community. I also have a monthly newsletter where I pick out hand-picked developer news items from the past month. And this includes a dev tip and a comic pick and also updates about the podcast. And it's a great way of keeping up to date with developer news. So if you want to sign up, there's a subscribe link on the podcast website. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Right, so like AI, I wasn't actually thinking we'd start with AI, but actually now we've started, this is such a great topic because like you mentioned ReSharper and how that and IntelliSense, how that changed things. And I don't know, do you feel that this, I can see it being compared to that, but for me, this feels very, very, very different. I don't know how you feel about that.
It certainly is different. Like I said, it's a big leap up from, showing you syntax and recommending things based on, for the most part, pattern matching. I've been playing a bit with Claude, and my opinion of it is, in certain realms, it does a really good job, and in certain realms, it doesn't. In C#, it's not as good as, let's say, React is on the client side. I just think the number of projects it's read out of open source and such is probably bigger there. But for me, I don't think prompt engineering or vibe coding or whatever you call it is necessarily going to be the thing that changes it. Because to get a good output from AI, you need to really describe what you're doing. And we did that in the 90s. It was called writing specs, right? And so if we're going to end up writing specs to feed into an AI model, is that going to be more beneficial than the way we're doing it now with user stories and designs and coding? So the thing that I found really interesting was the ability to very quickly scaffold a system you want to build with AI. And it may or may not be correct, but it's a good way to start. And I think probably my best usage of it, other than regular expressions, which I don't ever have to write again, thankfully, is for refactoring. Being able to say, oh, we made a bad choice here. Please go and change all these /API V1s to V2 or whatever it may be. It's really good at, with the context of an existing project, being able to make those changes more than I think it is to generating new projects. So that's kind of the approach. I'm not an expert in AI at all, or LLMs or any of that. I only know it from my perspective, using it for development. And so I'm open to being wrong about it. But I've kind of been on a soapbox about trying to tell people not to worry as much as they have been. We're going to all lose our jobs. We're in a space right now before AI that there was a compression of development anyway. In the last 5 years, you've seen some of the big tech firms lay off a lot of people. And I think there's some different reasons for that. And I don't think AI has really affected as many jobs as some of these other, the downturn in the economy and being more efficient or getting out of certain businesses. Most developers don't work for tech companies anyway, right? Most of them work for Siemens and Shell and Ford, and I haven't seen big layoffs in those sectors. It's mostly been in actual tech where it could be an argument that they overhired.
I kind of feel that I think a lot of developers nowadays, all the scaffolding and the actual tech stuff, they might spend their days doing that. And that means that they don't have to think about the business domain and the business problems. So that they're coding away and they don't really know what the business is trying to achieve. Where if AI is doing a lot of that, that means that whether it's prompting or whatever it is, how the developers are telling AI what the spec is, they're forced to actually think more about the business, which is a good thing in my mind.
I think it is a good thing, but I think it's a tough sell to some amount of developers, right? Some developers are about the code or about the problem. And some developers care more about the larger picture. Even if they're in the trenches writing code, some developers just care about how this affects, the business and therefore my continued employment and my satisfaction. And some people are just about the minutia. And those people may be more affected by it, but I'd also argue that that's not new. And what I mean by that is, this has always been the case. We started writing machine code, bare metal, painful in many ways, having to think about a lot of things about how the computer actually worked. And then we came up to, C and C++, where things were simplified, but you still had to manage a bunch of your own resources, memory, but lots of other, handles and etc. And so we keep on sort of coming up the ladder of what we need to care about. And I feel like AI is just another level there. In the recent past, the move to deploying through containers or through app services and those sorts of things, we stopped caring about the OS, which was a good thing, right? It's one, we're allowed to focus on the problem. And this, I think the AI being able to help us generate boilerplate code is going to allow us to focus more on it. But there will be some developers that are going to go kicking and screaming because they want to craft code from scratch. And I think there's still going to be a place for that. I just think you might want to think about how you do things a little differently.
I quite often think back to, if you remember, and I know you do, because we were talking about career lengths before, but when IntelliSense first was becoming a thing, and lots of developers were like, no, you can't use IntelliSense because that means you can't remember the syntax. And no one doesn't use IntelliSense nowadays. It's kind of is. And with ReSharper and stuff adding more completion, and now we've got multi-line completion, and now we've got AI creating, well, we mentioned vibe coding before, entire projects and stuff. This is just taking it all to the next level. And I wonder if this is the kind of thing where now, like AI creating projects or lots of code, where a lot of developers would be like, oh no, I need to write it myself. If actually in 5 years, that conversation just won't be a conversation anymore.
I suspect so. When you look at the way that we use new project creators, they create quite a lot of code for us and we're okay with it. And I think this is probably another maturation of that more than it is. because ultimately the developer is going to need to own the code that is generated, whether that's generated by a source generator or the file new project or AI. It's still going to come down to AI is never going to be able to, I say never, but never be able to understand exactly what needs to be done. We're still going to have to debug code ourselves.
Ooh, we say never. Thinking what AI was like 6 months ago, then 6 months before that, then 6 months before that. What's it going to be like in 6 months, let alone 5 years? It's mind blowing where it's going. But anyway, I guess this wasn't an episode on AI, but it's a fascinating conversation. Staying with tech though, a big open tech question. If you were to be given, because I know you mentioned you like front end and back end stuff, a new project, I don't know, it depends on the exact requirements and stuff, but a new web app project that required a database, a front end, a back end, maybe a cache or whatever, what would be your default kind of go-to tech stack?
If it's just I think it matters a lot about the size of the project and the company we're dealing with. But without having to get into that minutia, right now I would start with .NET API backend. I would start with a front end. I prefer Vue, but that kind of doesn't matter what you have in the front end. But I like that Vue is a little more concise than the others. I would probably use Postgres for the database, though I use a SQL Server quite a bit as a database as well. And for the most part, I have been starting to use Aspire more and more so that I can less think about where all the details are coming from. What I find interesting about it is that we can now sort of pick how we're going to construct an application. I no longer install SQL Server or Postgres on my machine. I always start up a container because it could not be easier than it is now to just go, Docker run. And not having to think about it, one of the things that Aspire and some other tools do is allow me to just say, okay, my system's going to be made of, I'm going to need Redis here, I'm going to need a data store there, I might need a service bus or something like it, or queues in my project, and then I can focus on the pieces that I care about instead of how do I configure this, how do I deploy it, all this other stuff. And that doesn't mean that I think that the project should be or could be microservice based. I don't think it's the way that a lot of these tools work is necessitating microservices and in some extension of that, Kubernetes. Like there's a real use case for all of that, but it's more about not having to worry about the deployment as much. And if we need to separate those into, some functions or be able to scale up the authorization and authentication separately, then we can refactor that in. But it's much more about, this is the package of not just my code, but also all the services that my code requires.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Aspire because I've been using it quite heavily recently. And actually, the last episode I had Maddie on and we were talking about Aspire. And for the listeners, if you want a course on it, I've just released a course on Dome Train about Aspire. So cheeky side mention there. But like you also mentioned Docker and things. And in the past, I've exactly like you for database and stuff for local development. Docker Compose up, spin it all up, all the stuff like databases. But now we don't need to, like literally in Rider or on the command line, .NET Run on the command line or F5 in Rider, all the stuff, databases and everything spins up and you get the Aspire dashboard and all that kind of thing. Oh, it's so nice. But yeah, as you say, it's just so different than it used to be. Before Docker and that kind of thing, it was just so different. So yeah, a much nicer place now, I think.
Yeah, I remember, the solution before Docker in many ways, before, much further back, which you just built a VM with all the services in one giant, VM. And that's still a solution, but it still requires you to update and maintain the OS, maintain all the updated versions of the products, make sure they're installed right, like all this work that none of us really want to do.
Yeah, I'm quite interested. You mentioned about Aspire and then deployment side of things, which with Aspire, it's not there yet at all. The local development for Aspire is amazing, but it's not mature for the deployment side. But they're working quite heavily on it. And so I think give it another 6 months, 12 months, it's going to be way better. I'm looking forward to when there's been talk about like Terraform, a publisher kind of thing for Aspire. So you can actually do all of that kind of stuff as well. So at the moment, I think it's you mentioned Kubernetes. It's kind of, if you're deploying to Azure, you're pretty much deploying to Kubernetes or you're deploying to Kubernetes, because the default is the AZ CLI going to Azure Container Apps, which is Kubernetes. Yeah. So it's kind of, or you can do it yourself with a deploy to your own Kubernetes cluster. But I think they're now just starting to do it more with the Azure App Services.
Yeah, they're working on Azure App Services, though it won't be as powerful as some people want. It's really going to be deploying to a single app service. I'm sure that over time that'll change. The piece that is in preview right now in version 9.3, I believe it is being able to deploy to Docker Compose, which sort of opens up the rest of it. Because Docker Compose is such a common format, being able to take your Azure project and go, essentially create me a Docker Compose, and then I can deploy this, whether it's AWS or others. And the community has created some deployment stories around this. There's a Aspire, it might be Aspire community, but there's a bunch of plugins people have developed for different systems. AWS is working on Aspire plugins as well themselves. I don't know if anyone's doing it for Google Cloud, but I've kind of dismissed Google Cloud as not much of a contender, but I'm sure I'm going to get some hate for that, especially the people I know at Google. They're going to be like, would you please stop saying that? But that's, that happens to me more times than I'd like.
I must agree. I don't think I've known many companies that work directly with Google Cloud, although that is where Kubernetes came from. So it's kind of...
Yeah. Kubernetes is one of those things that I think everyone jumped on because it looked like it solved a problem before they realized the amount of configuration and understanding of systems that you need for Kubernetes, to me, doesn't fulfill the need as much as it should, in that it can get overly complex really quickly and having to understand everything. Though Azure isn't a lot better. You really have to understand Bicep to really be able to understand how you want to deploy to Azure anyway.
Yeah, I find Kubernetes a tricky one, really, because it's a huge learning curve. But once you know it and you've used it for a while and you use it for lots of different things, it's so powerful and flexible, and you can just, it's just amazing once you get to that point. But there's the getting to that point and expecting an entire team to get to that point as well. So it's kind of it's a tricky one.
And what percentage of companies need that flexibility is the other sort of piece. The bill of sale that in many ways we as a community have sold to businesses, that everything needs to be a microservice, therefore probably needs to be in Kubernetes, I think has been a disservice for the most part. There's so many projects that don't need automatic scaling and, this and that, because they're just not that complex. Microservice with 3 different services, maybe. But when we think about, we need to scale this, and we need to, whether it's event driven or whether it's separating the databases and the need to bring them together to do reporting, I think we've, jumped on it almost too heavily. At conferences, there's always been a talk you should be using microservices in Kubernetes, And I think there's a little bit of a backlash to that right now. But probably my biggest problem with Kubernetes is it's clearly Kubernetes, and everyone pronounces it wrong. What do they call the command line tool?
I was going to ask that. How do you pronounce kubectl?
Cube, yeah. Because it should be Kubernetes, but I've lost that war a long time ago.
There's some different variations. Some people say kubectl, which is what I said. Some people say kubectl, kube control. I think lots of people say that in different ways, but
yeah, I always say kube control.
I would say kubectl, so it's tomatoes and tomatoes, isn't it, I guess?
That'd be my guess. I'm not sure it matters.
Yeah. I think with your microservice thing, you can definitely see especially with courses that people have been creating, there's definitely a push now towards this modular monolith kind of thing where, and I kind of agree really, because doing it that way means that you can go to microservices later and it's a bit easier. I guess the problem is you need constraints to make sure that it stays that way, and kind of having a network call of a microservice, that kind of enforces the constraints that you would want in something that's modular, but then obviously get all the complexities because network calls can go down. This whole microservice versus whatever, it's such a big conversation with so many different angles and pros and cons and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely true. When Steve Smith I saw him present about the modular monolith a year and a half ago now, something like that. I thought it was pretty revolutionary in that I'm a big believer of sort of refactoring. What I mean by that isn't, the sort of code to code, is that starting simple and refactoring to complex as you need it. It feels like the microservice solution is the opposite of that. We're going to optimize for us to need X, Y, or Z. Well, do you have that many customers? Are they actively using it? One of my clients I'm working with keeps on coming back to that. And I'm like, you have like 1,000 users a day for only like 12 hours of that day. What do you think you're going to benefit from it? That's the question I think we need to ask ourselves.
Yeah. I think also with the term microservice, at what point does something become a microservice? Because a typical app kind of has a front end, it might have an API, maybe two APIs, maybe a couple of worker services, and then people start adding, well, okay, so we need a bit of resiliency, so a lot of messaging, so there's a worker that's handling messages being published to RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus. At what point does that app, which just has a few of those bits, become an air quotes microservice?
I think we're too happy to find the catchword, and I think microservice is one of those, because the idea of how microservice works really came out of companies like Netflix, where they need that sort of decentralization and scale, and who else does? Like, there's not a lot of companies that are trying to handle the kind of scale or the data throughput that someone like a Netflix or a Disney Plus or is trying to do. I can also see it in like financial applications, right? You're trying to achieve these huge amounts of throughput because the difference between 1 second later and 1 second earlier may be a lot of money because the financial markets move. But you're creating credit applications. Let's be serious. It's just not rocket science. It's so well known, and the idea that we need all these different pieces. I'm going to get the phrase wrong, but the event-driven projects that are coming out now where everything is an event and then you have to materialize the events into some state.
Event sourcing.
Yeah, event sourcing. Thank you. Just makes me a little crazy. I understand and I think it solves a problem. But again, it's one of those things that I hear people like, oh, we really need to stop using data sources. We're going to do everything through event sourcing. And I'm like, just showing an invoice is going to require way more work than you think it is, right? Because there isn't one source of truth. You're always going to be, you're always data warehousing for one object in some ways, if you want to think about it in that sort of term. Again, certainly use cases where they would benefit from that. But I think I'm getting older and more cynical about anything new. That's certainly true of AI and microservices. And so I'm trying not to be cynical before investigation, because it is very easy, after so many years in the industry to go, so noisy.
Hi, Editor Dan here. Just a bit of context for the listeners. Shawn had some builders in the area making a lot of drilling and background noise. We were able to work around it by stopping during the drilling, and I've edited out those bits. But for this particular bit of the conversation, us talking about the drilling happened to then lead on to the next topic of conversation, about Shawn's move to the Netherlands. So I just needed to add a bit of context there to explain the sudden change of topic. Hope that makes sense, and back to the show.
I usually go out during the day. They supposedly they're going to be done in about 3 weeks, but if I know anything about construction, that may not be a realistic date.
Have you got noise-cancelling headphones?
I do. And I always sleep with ear pods in, so I can sleep through it. Isn't a problem. It's really during the day. And we live sort of just outside the center of Den Haag, and we have trams right in front of our house too. So luckily all the recording I actually do, not podcasts, is between 1 and 3 in the morning.
Oh, wow.
So everything's actually quiet. And I've always done that. All my Pluralsight courses were recorded in the middle of the night, because I've always lived in the city near noise, fire trucks and trains and all of that.
So do you sleep in the daytime to catch up, or do you just not need much sleep?
I do. I've always gotten up around noon. Now I have the excuse to tell people that it's because my American clients don't get in the office until 3, because I'm now 6 hours away. But I was doing this in the States too. I've always, this is just the way I'm able to record at night. I'm able to work in the afternoons with clients, and and it's been good enough.
Oh, fair enough, fair enough. How did your move go? Because it was you're in the Netherlands now, aren't you?
I am, and that was arduous in many ways. It took us a long time to get a lot of paperwork done. We flew with 3 cats, which I don't suggest anyone ever doing. It was a long, long day. I really can't complain. The system here in the Netherlands was super easy for us because there's a special American-Dutch treaty that allows us to come over if we start a business or we want to freelance. We can't take a job, but so it was pretty straightforward for us to come over, and the country's been really welcoming. I can't really complain. Finding housing is always difficult. They're having a big housing crunch here, but I feel like we got kind of lucky. We found a place we like and all of that. So I'm not sure we're settled. If you look behind me, we're still unpacking. But actually, the people on the podcast can't see behind me.
Well, actually, I've lived here for about 9 years, and if you saw over there out of the camera, which then it is kind of, it's a tip. But I'm very organized digitally, but yeah, my study's a mess.
Yeah, my old office was basically, I had a triangle of cleanliness in front of the cameras, and then it was crazy.
One of these days, I've never been to Amsterdam, which I'd like to go to.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you should. It's a unique place. I lived there in the 90s for a couple of years, so loud.
Well, if banging appears in the podcast, because obviously what we're talking about now, we started out talking about banging, so it's fine to keep some in so we've got some context.
Well, that's good. That's good. So we were talking about sort of where I would start in development. There is something that I think is important to think about when you're starting a new project, and that is, as a consultant, my job isn't to come in and dictate to customers what they build with. There's a lot of, I think, in our industry, a problem with, I just learned this, therefore we have to use it. Or I saw this at a conference talk or a YouTube video, and it's going to be the next big thing, and I need to have it on my resume. And for me, it's all about the culture of the organization. The kind of consulting I do, I don't want to be there very long. Like you, I want to help kick off and teach and maybe architect or code review the kinds of things you need in an organization, but I don't want to be that crucial wheel. I charge a little more, and some of it is to dissuade you from thinking I'm going to be a full-time employee, because I've done that. It's fine. It's just not what I do now. So understanding the skill set of the people you have, I think, makes a big difference. While I'm not the biggest fan of Blazor, I can see why a lot of companies are using Blazor, because they have long-term C# developers that certainly can benefit from having C# on both sides. And I can organizations that do the reverse. They have Node and JavaScript, TypeScript on the front end. I think we get too caught up in the fiefdoms that we're in. Oh, I'm a Microsoft developer, therefore anything that isn't what I know is going to be bad. And the polyglotness of it, I think, can be useful. It was just announced that we could now do run projects without having to create projects, right? Which is really interesting. I think mostly for me for sort of scripting. There are some cases where writing common scripts I would run instead of using PowerShell. But PowerShell might be the best case for it anyway. I think an example I want to highlight is one of my customers runs functions, Azure Functions. And we had talked about maybe writing them all in C#. And I said, well, you already have the PowerShell scripts. Why don't we just run the PowerShell scripts? And PowerShell is a valid way of running functions. And so why bother to rewrite it just because we can? If you already have all these assets and you just need to, run them as a cron job or in response to a GET or whatever it is, you don't need to necessarily have that uniformity. If you don't have the expertise in-house to manage them, sure, I get that. But if you do, especially at organizations that merge with each other where you might have a mix of these, that's actually one of the reasons I like Aspire, is it all doesn't need to be one tech stack,
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with what you were saying about like shiny object syndrome, where it's kind of all shiny tech syndrome. It's a new thing, so we need to use it. I think like one of the principles, like throughout this conversation that we're talking about, that comes to mind for me is KISS. If we keep it super simple, I know it should be keep it simple, stupid, but the official one. But I actually think the nicer one is keep it super simple. But yeah, just making all these things as simple as possible. So you've not got all these, like new developers would have to learn event sourcing, would have to learn all these different things if you put them in. So you need to remember all these different technologies that developers have to learn to work with it, especially if, like yourself, you're saying you're coming in, you're advising, then you're doing your consulting, but then moving on. So if you introduce your favorite shiny stuff, then you're leaving that team with that big stack. Interesting, you mentioned about Blazor before, because we're using Blazor on one of my main clients. Use Blazor quite heavily, and just recently going back to our AI conversation, which is something you touched on. Actually, you were saying that like React and that kind of thing has more code out there on GitHub and stuff, so AI's got more data to train on. I think with the whole vibe coding and that kind of thing, I hate that term, but the whole AI is going to be generating code for us and helping us out much more. That's actually quite important. So I think that's something to think about with choosing a tech stack. If you're going to be prompting AI to do your code, you want the AI to have a massive data set in that language. And is that Blazor or is that React? Which has a much higher data set? I think we know it's obviously React, isn't it?
Well, I think that's one of the fears. It certainly is React today, in that if we're relying on the AI tools and the models behind them to generate this, new technologies that may be better than old technologies are going to have a harder time finding an audience, because you can't have the kind of breadth to build the LLM without people using it. If people can't generate it from AI, it becomes this cycle where nothing can sort of break in, and we're going to be using the same technologies because they're well informed in our LLM. So that is certainly a fear on my side, is that every little thing, like I do mostly Vue, and the Vue generation isn't great because just the user base of Vue is less than something like React or even Angular. Do we combat that? Is it okay? Like what the Vue that it generates for me today is okay. It's not great. It's okay. But it's created the 90% boilerplate where I can go in and, tweak it, fix the things I don't like, or just use the refactoring tools to fix the things I don't like. But that's been true with, the new Vite project, or even the new project wizard in Visual Studio or CLI. They're never going to be perfect out of the box anyway.
With the AI stuff, another thing I wonder about is programming languages were written for humans to write code, and AI isn't a human. As we start migrating to AI writing more and more, why is it going from English to a programming language and then being compiled to machine code? It feels like AI would be able to. There's something else that AI would work better with if humans didn't have to read and write that code. And I kind of wonder what direction that would. And I'm talking like quite a bit further into the future now. It's kind of like, what is the programming language of AI is going to be?
Yeah, it's interesting because right now, really everything that AI does, programming and otherwise, is meant to be consumed by humans. So having it generate your code is with the mindset that someone else is going to validate what it is. Hallucinations aren't just, in writing term papers. Hallucinations are happening in many, many cases, and sometimes that's happening in programming as well. Programming is an interesting space in that there's a better way to validate it than, let's say, putting out a press release that has imagined articles or imagined science. What's the word I'm looking for? There's a famous example in the U.S. right now where our health service put out a explanation about vaccines, and they just made up studies. But evidently no one read it or checked it, or like you can't, this has happened to lawyers as well. Case law that doesn't exist and those sorts of things. I think that happens in the programming, but maybe less so because you can validate it, by seeing if it builds in some ways.
Yeah, I think this is another thing for tests as well. If you've got tests, making sure it works, then as long as it's not really badly performant, and if AI is generating the code, as long as you've got your test coverage passing, does it matter? But that's what it does. But I don't know. There's two sides of that argument, isn't there? But it's kind of you could say. I think there was a question. I can't remember. I think it was in a podcast a long time ago. I heard someone just a thought experiment. But if you had a big code base which had good test coverage, and you had to lose one thing, your code base or all your tests, which one would you lose?
That's hard to say. I mean, I understand the argument about keeping the tests, because then you can build it again and you have that, because the tests in many respects are going to embody the business rules, right? They're going to have that logic in them to make sure that it all works. It is an interesting point. You mentioned as long as it's fast enough or that it's performant. I find that very interesting because I think we focus as developers on performance probably more than we need to. I give a talk about minimal APIs, and the question I get every time is, aren't minimal APIs faster? And I was like, yes, but how much? Like, in the noise of making a single database request, you're never going to see the difference between a dozen technologies, right? The real performance issue is not how the bits are turning, JSON into objects or whatever the case may be, or the overhead of just having a pipeline. But I think as developers, that's something we can touch a little easier than worrying about how do I fix queries on the database, or how do I make fewer network hops, or whatever it is. And so I think this is actually a plus for AI, is that if we're not going to necessarily own every line of code, it should be fast enough, right? Certainly there are applications where speed is incredibly useful. It might help us as developers focus less on the performance of every small piece. And I think that's of great benefit.
Yeah, definitely. With the architecture stuff, less of the programming language thing now, but another thing I've been reading about and getting quite interested in is MCP, Model Context Protocol, which seems to be, and I know we're going on and on about AI stuff, but this feels like, and I'm not talking about using AI to generate code, and this is like an architectural thing where you've got MCP clients and servers, and it seems to be like it's come from nowhere. Obviously, Anthropic created this, and then everyone else is embracing the standard. But that feels like it's going to become a big thing.
I'm not as knowledgeable about MCP as I probably should be. I've noticed it go around, but with the move, I haven't had time to sort of dig in because this is all moving so quickly. I think it's a very interesting idea because it seems like we're into this push of less generating code than integrating LLMs into our projects to help our users. And I think, I hate to say it this way, but I think AI is becoming the 4K of this decade, right? Everyone's going to slap AI on everything because they think it can help and because it helps marketing. Like people go, ooh, we just bought a new TV when we moved. And of course, it's an AI. AI is all over the descriptions. And I'm like, what do you really think AI is doing? My accounting system just added an AI chatbot. I'm like, I'm just going to put in my invoices. I don't know what you think AI can do for me. And so I do fear that a little. There are certainly some amazing use cases where it could be helpful, but I do fear the saturation and the inevitable drop-off might hurt technology going forward.
Yeah, I think so. So I use Notion for my note-taking. I use that quite heavily for notes. Mm-hmm. And they've started and I don't use any AI in it, but they've started really pushing AI. And even now, if I'm in a Teams call, Notion pops up saying, would you like me to transcribe and summarize and everything? And I'm not even using you for video calls. Why, Notion, why are you popping up asking? Mm-hmm. And it's just go away. I just want to use Notion for notes. I don't want you doing any AI stuff. But one concern I have, and I think this is something we're going to see, is with the whole vibe coding where you can prompt an application. And I've tried it. You can go into VS Code agent mode and say, in Node, write me an application that does this, and it'll go off and do it. And then you can prompt it and make tweaks. It's mind-blowing. The problem is that I'm an experienced developer, so me doing it is different than someone that just wants to start a startup that knows nothing about programming. And they just want, I've had an app idea, I'll prompt it. There's going to be a bubble where lots of people are doing that aren't programmers, that don't really understand it, and they're just prompting away and making apps. They're releasing it out without knowing about the security implications or any of that kind of stuff. And we're going to have a massive influx of applications and stuff which is being published and deployed. And it's going to break in some horrible way. And it's going to, we're going to get to this breaking point when actually something needs to happen.
Well, I think it's also going to cause issues with the app stores. Because right now there's so much proliferation of junk that they go to third-party, cheaper developers to just make them something, and they're not going to do much testing, but just get it out there to see if we can get advertising revenue or whatever. AI is going to make that exponentially worse. You're just going to have all these apps being submitted that were generated, maybe, who knows how many per second. And, I just hope that doesn't happen to JavaScript frameworks. It's already bad enough how many come out every week. But I agree. It's difficult to know that what you built is correct if the person developing it or maintaining it doesn't know what was generated. They just know when they press F5, oh, it looks like it works.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting times ahead. So we've spoken about lots about AI and stuff, but we've not really spoken about the different things in your career. And although that's one of the things we're going to talk about, you've done a film called, and I'm sorry, I've not watched it yet. And it's been on my list for a long time, but Hello World film?
Yeah, right before COVID, was it right before COVID? No, it was like 2018. I'd always wanted to make documentary films. Like, it was just something that I'm fascinated by. I watch a ton of them. And so I met somebody that sort of mentored me through the process and was like, oh, this is not as daunting as I thought it would be, or expensive, because I really thought I'd need, $1 million, which, surprise, surprise, I don't have. And so I started to make a film about developers because I love this industry. Like, it's really been a gift to me in many ways, saved my life in many ways. And then about a year in, my editor was editing the project, and we have this little montage of developers. And his wife said, that's a lot of white dudes. And it was sort of this turning point where I was like, oh, this might be what it needs to be about, because I didn't notice. I felt very guilty that, I hadn't noticed that the people I had picked to interview for the film fit into this mold of what I think developers look like. And so that's sort of the output of this film, is to my realization that not only was I maybe part of the problem, but I didn't even see the whole problem, because I was really looking at like the number of women in development, which is still somewhat low, 20, 25, maybe 30% on a good day. But then I realized that people of color are so underrepresented in the first world and the third world, in that in the US at least, they make up about 3.5% of development. That's way lower than the 26%, I think it is, at least the last time I looked, of the representation in the country as a whole. And so in the movie, we delve into some of the reasons for that. And some of it is affluence, some of it is education. There is real, discrimination out there. There's sexism out there. But I think most of the problem isn't about that. It's about this idea of what we think developers look like. I dropped out of high school and college. I should not have been as successful as I've been, but I look the part. I look like the comic book guy. I look like I could be in a dark room and write code. And so I think I got jobs when maybe I didn't deserve them. Whereas if, a black woman applied for the same job, they wouldn't have had that benefit. They would have had to prove or overprove their skill set. And I think that's more this bias versus discrimination is the bigger issue. And that's one of the things I explore in the film.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of the time when you think about discrimination, you think about intentional action like racism or that kind of thing. Or actually, it's just that, as you said, we just don't think about it as people go about the jobs and don't notice. And I think you mentioned 30% on a good day for female programmers. I wouldn't say it's anything like that, because I've been a developer a long time. I generally can't think of a female developer I've actually worked with, which is really sad. Such a shame. But yeah, I mentioned before that I've not watched your Hello World yet, but I'm going to prioritize that and definitely make sure I watch it.
Yeah, if people do want to watch it, they can go out to helloworldfilm.com. It's available on iTunes and Amazon and those sorts of places.
Cool. I'll definitely make sure I include a link in the show notes to that.
Appreciate that.
I'm just looking at your other career stuff. I've started very recently getting into mind maps, like using mind maps. As I say, I used to use Notion. And so all my podcast notes and stuff were in Notion, so just text and bullet pointed, indentated lists and stuff. Well, I'm just playing around with Xmind, and I'm using mind maps quite heavily now. And so I'm trying this for this episode, and it's actually really useful because it's like all coloured mind maps of different things we could talk about. But yeah, that's
awesome.
Xmind's very cool. So I know you've mentioned earlier, but you were saying you've done quite a lot on Pluralsight. as someone that's just started doing courses very, very recently, so I'm very new to it, I'm quite interested to hear your experiences with Pluralsight course creation.
So it's been interesting. I started doing teaching back in the sort of Silverlight days when I sort of fell into Silverlight. And I realized how much I enjoyed that problem of figuring out how to tell the story, that courses need to have an arc, not just a list of facts. And so when Pluralsight started up, I reached out to them and we talked and started doing courses. And, 15 years later or whatever it's been, I have 27 courses on there by now. And it's been such a good thing for me. And it's been an interesting ride because I realized that I'm having more impact on people writing courses than I really ever have in development. Like, I used to say that I'm sick of calculating commissions, which is, sort of the business case that over the years and years, there's always 7 things that businesses want developers to do. And I got a little burnt out from that. Whereas teaching was something very new and I could see the impact almost immediately. I could see, when I was doing in-person courses, which I sort of prefer, just doesn't scale as well. I can't teach the kind of people I've taught through Pluralsight. And it's been really good. I hear from people that, started or know my voice more than my face, which I can sort of understand. My favorite question for them is, how fast do you watch my courses? Like, is it 1x, 1.5, 2? Because I think it's sort of interesting how almost no one consumes our content at regular speed.
Then you hear someone in real life and it sounds like they talk really slow because you're used to listening to them at like 2 times speed or anything.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been really good. I find that, some days I feel like I'm a better teacher than a developer. I don't know if that's true, but that's how it's felt. Because I've gone in these 15-year arcs. I did hardcore development for 15 years, and then I did teaching for 15 years, and I'm sort of in that third 15 years, and I'm trying to figure out what the next interesting thing for me to do. Because I think one of the things people should think about in a career is that you may want to do the same thing you're doing today for 30 years, or maybe not. And sort of looking forward, do you want to manage teams? Do you want to be a consultant? Do you want to be a manager? Any of those things, you kind of have to figure out what you're going to enjoy long term. Being a junior developer for 45 years is probably no one's dream.
That's one of the reasons I like just because I work through my own company. I've got a limited company which I work through. I've got a few different clients. And then I've got obviously the podcast and various things and the courses. So just having that variation. If you're a member of staff, it's kind of like you doing that 9 to 5 until you resign and then move to do something else. Or actually working for yourself. There's so much more variation and satisfaction. So I do love the direction that being self-employed, is that the right term? Or entrepreneur or whatever you want to call it. Is
certainly self-driven, Through Pluralsight, I've been able to teach over 1 million students, and that's not something I could have done in really any other way to have an effect on, maybe 1 million people's careers in some small way. That at the end of the day, I want to have the satisfaction that, what I do matters. It's not just about a paycheck.
Yeah, definitely. That is impressive. So 27 courses and 1 million students. That's very impressive.
I think like 80% of them are from one course series I did. I have 27 courses, but it's been the sort of end-to-end course that goes from .NET all the way through a JavaScript project that the vast majority of my viewers have come from. I've done a lot of other courses on API design and other things that certainly have an audience, but nothing like that one course that we update every 2 years as the technology changes.
What is the course?
It's called Building a Web App with .NET, Tailwind, and Vue. So sort of take it from beginning to end to just see how that works. Because one of the things that I enjoy in what I teach is showing the code. So I actually write while I'm doing the course. I file new, write all the code so that people can see all the moving pieces, not just slides that tell them how to do things.
Very cool. So we are very quickly running out of time. Before we move on to dev picks, I've got one final question. We've spoken a lot about you creating courses to teach others, but what's your preferred method for your learning for when you're picking up a new technology?
I always try to learn new technology by doing. So I'm going to refer to some YouTube videos. I'm going to look at some courses, whether it's on LinkedIn or Pluralsight or one of those. And I like reading blogs quite a lot to help me sort of get new on this. But if I don't build something with it, I'm not going to learn. My blog, which has been around since, 1997, I think. I have recreated it so many times because every time I need to learn something new, I was like, it's time. Let me redesign it and re-implement it and figure out how to import the 2000 stories or whatever it is at this point. Because I think if you don't do, at least for me, I can't just read a book and go, oh, now I understand how that works. I really need to get in and get my hands dirty. Because I think in technologies, there's a ramp, right? And I call it, when I'm learning into new technology, it starts off and I say, oh, this is stupid. And then we go a little further and I go, oh, I'm stupid. And then I get to this crest where it all sort of comes together. And accepting that both of those things are going to happen before it allows me to push forward or not discount technologies because maybe they're approaching it a different way than I thought they should.
Yeah. And then some technologies, it's like, this is stupid. No, I'm stupid. No, this is definitely stupid.
That does happen. That does happen. But I won't mention any of those technologies directly.
Yeah, maybe wise. Cool. So shall we do dev tips?
The thing that I'm most interested today that I think would be a great dev tip is learning how to debug in different ways. There's an idea I've had for a long time called sight reading. In music, it's something that musicians do where they're given a brand new piece of music and they have to sight read it. They have to figure out what it sounds like and be able to play it very quickly. And I would love developers to start thinking about code in that way. You should be able to read it. If you need to press F5 or start the project or debug it in order to understand it, I think you're missing some of the boat. Because if you have to read and understand that code, I think us starting to think about, like we had to many, many years ago, read the code to figure out what it does, I think we'll all be better for it. Also, it ends up improving the quality of your code if you're thinking about it in that aspect as well. I don't know if that's really a dev tip, but I really wish people would start thinking about it in that way.
I think it definitely is a dev tip because one thing and I'm guilty of this as well, if I'm looking through code that I was going to say not mine, but even if it was mine like a week ago or something, whatever, but and I'll scan through, try and get an idea by scanning. Where actually, if I just slowed down a bit and read each line of that method I'm reading, I wouldn't have missed the thing that caused me 2 hours of problems. And it's just like slowing down a bit sometimes and just looking line by line and not just skimming stuff is quite powerful too.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
So my dev tip is, and this goes back to learning actually. So we all use LLMs to ask AI questions. And we say like, how do we do this? How do we do that? But actually, a very good way of learning is, with learning, there's something called passive something or other, where you might reread a book again and again, or read some information again and again, and you're always rereading it. You're not actively trying to get it from your own memory. Where if you're doing like active recall from your own memory, that's been proven to really make that stick into long-term memory. And there's a whole bunch of stuff called spaced repetition and stuff. So following along with that, with an LLM, if you ask it a question, ask it to ask you questions about a technology. So let's pick up something like Terraform, for example. Like if you go with like Terraform and say I've been learning Terraform and I want to check that I know it. If I go to like ChatGPT and say, ask me questions about Terraform, and then that's making me answer those questions. So I'm pulling it from memory. It's also giving me a bit of a gap analysis of what I don't know. And playing around with this, I actually prompted ChatGPT to come up with a prompt to do that, to ask me questions. And I told it about this concept of active recall. So I want to do that. I want to do spaced repetition. And it actually gave me a prompt which told itself to ask me questions one at a time. And then when I answered it, each question, it would review my question and tell me if I'm right and give me a review on each question. And that was like, whoa, that's awesome. Because it's making me answer the question, but it's also giving me feedback on each of my answers. And also there's no pressure. If I don't, like, as in, if another human being is kind of quizzing me and I don't know something, there's a bit of like, you feel that you should know something and then you're embarrassed or whatever. Where with an LLM, I don't care if it's got it wrong. I've learned something, and I can drill this and improve and learn stuff. But there's none of that self-consciousness.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I'm going through the same thing trying to learn Dutch. And there are the tools that are, this is this, this is this, this is this. But one of the tools I'm really benefiting from, I think it's called Quizzle. They do this where they start with understanding where you're at and then mimicking back. And they make sure they revisit things, even if I think I know them 3 or 4 times, and go from multiple choice to writing it down and then to speaking, to really cement that stuff into long-term memory. So it's very interesting you're talking about it in programming, because I've been waist deep in it for the few months we've been here.
Nice. Yeah, I would love to learn another language, but it's one of these things. You have so many different things, and then there's priorities, and there's you've got to put it in order. And there's another thing called Anki, which I mentioned before in the podcast, where it's this spaced repetition where you can just get it's flashcard system, but using spaced repetition, and it does all this. And I found that very powerful for remembering stuff, because my memory's rubbish, but actually using tools like this can help me. But yeah, it's all quite cool.
That's awesome.
Cool. So before we wrap up, is there anything that we've not spoken about that you would like to?
I don't think so. People can find me at wildermuth.com if they're interested. I work both in the US and in Europe, so if anyone's interested in reaching out or watching my courses on Pluralsight, probably the only thing we haven't mentioned is my YouTube channel, Coding Shorts, where I do 10 to 12 minute videos on things that are too short to do a class and too short to do a talk on. So it gives me that creative outlet. I have, I think, 120 of them or something by now.
Nice. I'll definitely make sure I include a link to all of those things in the show notes.
Awesome.
Well, with that, thank you for joining us. It's been a really fun conversation. When I was thinking about what we can talk about, I hadn't thought about AI, and then we just started at the start, and then it's it made total sense because of what's happening at the moment. But yeah, it's been such a fun conversation, so thank you.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Cool. And thank you everyone else for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Everstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do help me spread the word on the socials. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Blue Sky at danclark.com. But the best place to get in touch with me is on Discord, and we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.